This is a conversation with Dr. Fadi Bardawil. He's an assistant professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University, and he's the author of the book Revolution and Disenchantment, Arab Marxism and the Binds of Emancipation. I wanted to have this conversation with Dr. Bardawil because his study of the 1960s Arab New Left, and especially the Lebanese New Left of that period, evoked curious comparisons to what protesters in Lebanon are having to face today as well. The experience of the Lebanese New Left offers insights into how intellectuals struggled with the questions of theory and practice, and of how to transform societies despite all their contradictions. As you'll hear in this conversation, Dr. Bardawil, who is of the Civil War generation, is very much in conversation himself with the generation that came before his. At the same time, and for different reasons, I, as someone from the post-war generation, am in conversation with the war generation through Dr. Bardawil. As such, we managed, hopefully successfully, to have 3 generations of Lebanese briefly conversing with one another. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireThesTimes and on Instagram at TheFireThesTimes, and you can also support it on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, the links which are in the description. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Joey, for your interest in my work, and thank you for taking the time to read it in these turbulent times. I'm trained on the PhD level as a cultural anthropologist, and before that I had an MA in sociology. For a long time now, around 2 decades, I've been interested in one main theme, which is basically the relationship of cultural production to political practice and political engagement. Around 20 years ago, I started this research project, and it ended up in an MA thesis in the sociology department at the American University of Beirut, which traced the trajectory of the communist Lebanese musician and playwright Ziad Rahbani in his relationship to the Rahbani's inheritance as a heir to Fairuz and Asr Rahbani, and in relationship to the other politically committed leftist musicians who were around at the time. The most well-known ones that you may recognize are people like Khaled al-Habr, Marcel Khalifi, Ahmed Qabour, and some other people who were big then but not so much, no longer now, Al-Kawras al-Shabi, etc. And the idea then, which I pursued later on, was to try and think the different mediations and relationships between, again, as I mentioned, political engagement and practice and fields of cultural production. My PhD is in cultural anthropology. I continued pursuing this idea, but I moved from an understanding of culture in its relationship to aesthetics, which is what was my project in the MA thesis, focusing on plays and music and radio shows, and moved towards interrogating the relationship of theoretical production to political practice. Roughly speaking, since my sort of PhD work, I have been working in a triangle which consists of intellectual history, political anthropology, and critical theory. So my work is sort of located in the parameter of these three traditions, because part of my interest is literally in how can we rethink contemporary Arab thought, but also how can we think of contemporary Arab thought, and I will say more about that later, in its relationship to being embedded in certain political parties and political practices. And the question of critical theory comes into the foreground because I'm interested in how can we develop a critical theory of power in our societies, one that takes the specificity of the multiplicity of logics of power into being. And what I mean by critical theory is not only the strand of theory that was produced by the Frankfurt schools, such as Adorno and Horkheimer, and people in their orbit, such as Walter Benjamin. But I include in that the tradition of post-colonial theory, and namely the tradition I sort of work with and think about is mainly the Indian subaltern studies tradition, as well as the tremendous work inaugurated by the work of Talal Asad, and in Talal Asad's wake, Edward Said.
Okay, thanks for that introduction. So to start with a contextualization of the topic of our discussion, would you mind explaining a bit why you felt it important to go back to the 1960s to excavate the lost archives of what you called, or what is called, I think, the Lebanese New Left?
Sure. I mean, this project, like all other projects, sort of takes shape as you stumble through different pieces of material, and the end product does not basically resemble what you started with. I started with an interest in thinking about the ideological, what I then called the sort of like ideological movement of former 1960s leftists into more liberal positions, particularly in the wake of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when the Arab press was talking about sort of using a catch-all categories to refer to some journalists, thinkers, public intellectuals as Arab liberals, liberaliyun Arab. So, and a lot of these Arab liberals, so to speak, that were basically part of the sort of conversations then had leftist backgrounds. But then as I met some of the militant intellectuals I was interested in meeting, hearing their stories about their life trajectories, and also stumbling upon an archive that I did not know existed when I had started the research project, which is basically the archive of the underground bulletins of the Lubnan Ishtiraki Socialist Lebanon, which is the Marxist group I ended up focusing on mostly in this work. And the archives were, as is the case in a lot of cases in the Arab world, was preserved by individuals. So it was basically a private archive. In that case, it was preserved by Ahmed Baidoun, who's a distinguished Lebanese historiographer, amongst other things, but who was also a member of Socialist Lebanon. So he was the former comrade, so to speak, who had preserved most of the bulletins, and he gave me access to all of his personal archive that I read and was interpolated with directly, and sort of decided to sort of think through it seriously. Now, why for our present? Why excavate this archive for our present? I think there are three major themes that sort of, for me, structure, if you want, the sort of the critical yield of bringing that archive and analyzing it in and for our present. And roughly speaking, you could say that these three themes are, one is historical, the other one, the second is political, and the third is theoretical. So I'll say a few words about each. Historically, I think that 1960s generation is a fascinating generation in its own right, particularly in the Arab world. We're thinking about people who were roughly born between the late 30s and the mid 40s. So they were around 6, 7, 10 years old when the Palestinian Nakba took place in 1948. They were in their early teens or around 10 years old when the Egyptian Revolution happened, and when Nasser basically took power in its wake. So it's a story of a generation that really lived through successive seismic transformations of our modern Arab history, in a time which was very, very much ideologically saturated. So you can think about the sort of dialectic of political hope and disenchantment as defeats they've lived through. So think about, sort of opening up your eyes to the world. And we're talking really, we're not talking about sort of like ideas, but we're talking about experiences, So many of these intellectuals I've interviewed sort of say that their first childhood memories are of Palestinian refugees sort of arriving in Beirut in 1948 when they were like, 8 years old, 10 years old, and seeing the refugees, like, and sort of basically collecting, going from neighborhood to neighborhood with bags and sort of collecting some donations for them, such as food, batteries, blankets, etc. So we're talking really about a somatic, experiential memory that's embodied in these people's sort of trajectories. We're not talking about the attraction just of anti-imperialist politics on paper, but we're really talking about you have to sort of put yourself in that generational perspective of basically, sort of shivering from joy when you're sort of like hearing Nasser's voice nationalizing the canal in 1956 and you're 15 years old, something like that. And of course the setbacks as well, such as the huge setback that is not really discussed that often today, which was basically the rupture of the union between Syria and Egypt. The union took place in 1958, and it was the sort of rupture and infisal took place in 1961. So roughly, this was the first very important setback to the project of basically Arab nationalism before the 1967 defeat, which then became a very, very important historiographical marker for trying to think through the history of contemporary Arab thought and the trajectory of these intellectuals. So basically the historical arc of the book, because the book has a critical project, but it also has a historical story, and it's trying to do both at the same time. The historical arc of the book is really one of trying to think about the experiences of a generation that moved, if you want, that moved from nation to class to community, by which I mean they moved from basically being interpolated by Arab nationalism to becoming basically class Marxist critics of Arab nationalism when they became Marxists in the mid-60s, to basically the moment of their disenchantment with the left when they became critics of basically communal solidarities. What I mean by communal solidarities are sectarian regional kinship solidarities. Or some of them, in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, became attracted to Khomeini's politics, which are basically politics of sort of cultural decolonization and authenticity. So what you have really is an arc of people who in their lifetime moved again from nation to class to community and or religion. And that's a fascinating story because it encapsulates a lot of our post-colonial predicament. So that's the historical arc of the book, and that's why I think it's important to excavate the experiences, the writings, and basically the archives of this 1960s generation that lived through all of that. For someone like me who's born in the first years of the Lebanese civil wars in the wake of 1975, you could imagine that it was a very, very different time to be born into and to be raised into, especially in terms of sort of like political hopes and the sort of thinking about open horizons and revolutionary horizons. So when you're 10 years old in 1985 or something around that, it's very different than being 10 years old in the mid-50s. In terms of political hope and thinking about how that structures your generational location. Politically, I think it's important on many levels. One of them, because I think there are two political readings of this history that I seek to avoid, and I think are problematic in their own way. One is the melancholic reading, which is basically a reading of a history of decline, which is basically the 60s was the golden age of the left and of international solidarity and everything afterwards is a history of decline. That melancholic reading of sort of like being attached to, it's melancholic in the sense that you cannot let go of the object you're attached to, and they're basically attached to that moment in the 60s, and then everything else becomes insignificant in the present. And the sort of mirror image of this sort of golden age melancholic reading is a liberal and Islamic triumphalism. And I say liberal and Islamic triumph because both the liberal reading and the Islamic reading are triumphalists in the sense of saying, well, I mean, why go back to these leftists of the 60s? You know, obviously they were defeated, obviously they did not produce anything. From the Islamic perspective, you can say that obviously, you know, Marxism is a foreign import, and you know, you realize that foreign graft did not work in our societies. If you're liberal, you would say, I mean, look at what happened in the sort of Soviet bloc and Eastern Union. So between a complete disparaging of this experience as a full-on failure or defeat, and between a complete fetishization and melancholic attachment to it, I tried to carve a path in which we can sort of critically inherit, if you want, the dual legacy of this 1960s generation, the legacy of both revolution and disenchantment. And this became especially important for me after the first wave of Arab revolutions that were ignited into 11. Because as I was writing this book, you know, this question of revolution and disenchantment was no longer a sort of archival story, but it became literally a story of the present as we witnessed the first waves of the Arab revolutions and then the waves of counter-revolutions in their wake. And it basically occurred to me that really, in and for our political present, to think of a previous generation who had gone through this dialectic of hope and despair is very, very important as an antidote against public amnesia and as an intergenerational conversation. Now that the question of revolution has been opened up again, but in a different form. So this is the political kind of, sort of impetus behind the book. And third is the question of theory, which is basically, how do you read the archive of critical and revolutionary Arab theory? And how do you read it without over-determining it in its relationship to the West? I.e., how do you read it beyond that sort of reading that have become very normalized in the wake of Edward Said's Orientalism, which is to look at Arab intellectuals and to sort of test their discursive assumptions to see whether they're self-orientalizing, whether they're westernized thinker or they're autochthonous ones or not. How do you sort of get a sense of the project they were trying to fashion without banishing them or banishing their legitimacy by saying that they sort of like, oh, what they're doing is just reproducing colonial taxonomies or Orientalist assumptions? Because I thought that this is not a way to sort of like have a conversation with the past, and this was not a charitable reading, and this was also a politically problematic reading that sort of looks on from the perspective of the present as having a theoretical superiority to the past without any reflexive position of what makes us in the present basically sort of superior, theoretically more enlightened than people in the 70s or in the 60s, just because we read one or two books more that were published in the meantime. It seemed to me that there is something here that in a way is reproducing in practice a historicist logic that it's criticizing in theory, i.e. it criticizes some of these thinkers for saying that, you know, we are not modern enough. So it's a historicist critique, while their critique of them as theoretically unsophisticated or something like that reproduces this kind of sort of like lagging behind critique that they're doing. Now, why is this important? Because I think it's important for also attempting to not reinscribe the colonial divide in dealing with theory. I.e., what I mean by that is very simply, trying to think, to not reinscribe the fact that theory is only produced in the global north, and the global south either produces facts or local native informants for the factories up north that produces theory. So I wanted to also theoretically avoid that, and to actually, in a way, show that there is a complexity of this sort of like critical tradition, which was a very transversal tradition in the sense, and what I mean by transversal is that it's not interdisciplinary, it's transversality, i.e. these thinkers were not thinking about how do we put cultural studies in conversation with history, but rather they're thinking, if our present, if these are the questions we're interested in our present, what should we read? So you could read Bourdieu, you could read Ibn Khaldun, you could read Lacan, you could read Fanon. But the question is that the readings were geared towards an intervention in the present, not towards an academic exercise in bringing disciplines together. And I wanted to try and capture that, and try and move again beyond this colonial divide that sometimes you see this sort of colonial divide in very implicit ways in some of the some titles of articles or books. Like imagine a title that of a book which says something like reading Althusser in Ras Beirut, and that's the kind of thing I want to avoid, because that reading Althusser in Ras Beirut is sort of saying implicitly that, oh look, there's something curious about reading this universal global thinker in this particular location, which is Ras Beirut. And I was trying to say that there's nothing to be excited about reading Althusser in Ras Beirut, because these kinds of texts were always read, written and translated and commented on. So the idea of trying to sort of make an event out of something that I wanted to sort of show was there was also at the heart of it. Another way of thinking about this is sort of like how I tried to sort of include someone like Edward Said as a character in the story I'm telling, and not as the theorist that would frame this generation's basically lives. Because if you look at books about contemporary Arab thought that are published in English for the Euro-American Academy, Edward Said is never treated as like an Arab intellectual, and his trajectory is sort of excavated in that way, but he's treated as a theorist whose theories in a way frame other intellectuals. So I wanted to sort of avoid again this inscription of who's the theorist, who's the local intellectual, who's the person you cite to frame other people, who are the people who are framed, so to speak. Especially that historically this was not accurate. Edward Said was in conversation with and friends at some point with some of these intellectuals that I sort of discussed in the book, such as Sadiq al-Azam or Fawaz Trabulsi, who ended up being also a good friend of his, and also his translator into Arabic. He translated Out of Place. He also translated basically on I think the late works that Said published. So in a way, there is a particular implicit ideology in deciding who's the Arab intellectual and who's not, and who's the theorist, that I wanted to sort of implode from the inside as well, by showing that these analytical frames are in a way themselves sort of like, if you want, complicit in reproducing this sort of colonial divide. This is politically very important, especially that Arab thought has been for at least 100 years produced from the Arab world and in Arabic, and from outside the Arab world and in languages other than Arabic. I mean, you can think of people like Mikhail Naimi and Khalil Gibran and all these early authors that were in the States for a long time and were producing in Arabic and in English. But you should also could think about the Palestinian diaspora after 48, and then the Lebanese diaspora, and then more recently the Syrian diaspora after the Syrian Revolution in 2011. So in a way, Arab thought itself is at times exilic, at times diasporic, at times produced from home. So there's a way in which we should, I was trying to think through this question of multiplicity of languages and multiplicity of places without sort of like the pitfalls that I tried to describe. That was a very long I think, answer to your question. But I think these are the headings I'm working with: the question of history, the question of politics, and the question of theory.
That was an excellent expose into all of this. Thanks a lot, actually, for taking the time. You know, while talking, while listening to you, I couldn't help but reflect on this notion of this kind of intergenerational conversation, because as you mentioned, you're excavating the works of a previous generation, and I'm sitting here as the person from the next generation, the post-war generation, being born right after the war ended, and I just couldn't help. That's why, like, there is this question I'm going to ask you now. I just couldn't help but think of, like, I read the book and I absolutely loved it, like, genuinely, and it's one of those books that I feel like I'll definitely revisit in the near future as well. And so the question was, like, Sharara, who's one of the co-founders of Socialist Lebanon, and Ahmed Baidoun, both of them saw former comrades of theirs leave left-wing causes to join either sectarian groups or maybe just retreat altogether from politics. In other words, like, from what I understood, in some ways, political sectarianism trumped class-based solidarity, which is obviously the underpinning of this whole worldview. And it's something that I've seen in some of these films, like We Were Communists, I think, if I remember correctly, mentions that. One of the ex-communists ended up joining Hezbollah, another one ended up joining the Lebanese forces or something like that. I forgot the details. But based on your own experience, having gone through these archives now for the past decade or so, how would you... so what were your reflections based on those readings of the Lebanese New Left's archives? How would you assess the current dynamics today? Do you see some similarities, some echoes maybe, or some radical differences, or maybe, you know, a mix of all of those three?
That's a great question. But I wanna ask you, what exactly do you mean by dynamic today? And then I think that will give me a clearer sort of perspective of how to answer your question of the sort of multiple routes one can exit from leftist militancy into. Because I can talk about the past for sure, but because you ended with the question of the dynamic today, so that, yeah, I want to try and relate both of, you know, my historical work in the past to what you mean by the dynamic.
Absolutely. So I'll give a bit of background to kind of situate it a bit more concretely. I was one of the early organizers of the 2015 Youth Think movement. Left it at some point to do my studies abroad. And in the early, the recent uprising, I was just a participant, documenting, researching a bit of journalism here and there. And one of the, in between those 4 years, which I find to be really pivotal to myself, to many of my friends around me, usually activists who are as experienced as I am, if not more so. And there's always this dynamic, this tension that I feel we haven't, or we have this unease when it comes to sectarianism. We don't fully understand, or we don't fully know, if you want, what to do with it. It's kind of like the elephant in the room most of the time. With the 2019 uprisings, it's the first time that I know of that, or it did happen before 2015, we did see it, even 2011, 2012, we did see a bit of it, but 2019 was really, so October 2019 was really the point where, for me anyway, it's the first time that I saw so many people so openly and so confidently chant stuff like Sha'bi Yurid Isqat al-Nizam or Kullun Yani Kullun, so the people want the downfall of the regime, or all of them means all of them, and have explicit anti-sectarian messaging, like very, very explicit anti-sectarian messaging. And even with that explicit anti-sectarian messaging, we immediately started seeing within the first month, I mean, in addition to the attacks obviously by sectarian party supporters, or whatever we want to call them, in addition to all of that, within, you know, after a month or so, by November, I would usually started after November 22nd, so Independence Day, we started seeing a sort of a, how would I describe it? we became a bit more afraid or a bit more timid when it comes to openly calling these people by name. So the warlords, the sectarian oligarchs, and so on. Because we felt that, and I'm saying this as an interpretation, other people might have a different interpretation, of course. But from where I was standing, we started feeling maybe subconsciously that we are alienating too many people now because we are attacking these people. So naming Nasrallah, naming Birri, naming Jaja, and so on and so on. And when I was reading your book, I couldn't help but see some parallels. And again, very limited, different times, obviously very different context. There are certain shocks that are not the same. So the Nakba isn't the same as the dissolution of the union between Egypt and Syria, and isn't the same as 67, isn't the same as the Civil War. And for the same reasons, it isn't the same as the 2011 uprisings, obviously. But the shock for me, as someone who is both Lebanese, part Palestinian, and who has, more importantly, followed Syria much more closer than any of the other countries in the region, recently anyway, there was always in the back of my mind this kind of feeling that, how do I describe this? That history is, that's a wrong way of putting it. That we are being overwhelmed by structures, by ideologies, by ways of being, by ways of interpreting the world, all of these things combined. And we, the new ones, the new generation, haven't really had much time to either learn from the previous generation's mistakes, because mainly we don't know them, we haven't read about them most of the time. Some have, but most haven't, and so on and so forth. So this is a background a bit of where I'm coming from with this, and what my positionality with this would be as someone who grew up in post-war Lebanon, now is studying post-war Lebanon, which inevitably obviously includes the war itself, a bit of the pre-war, but not as much. And there's this sinking feeling, in a sense, that you're digging the archives of the 1960s as someone who was of the 1970s and 1980s generation. And here I am of the 1990s and early 2000s generation reading that book. And it just feels like at some point, like there's a bit of a circular motion happening, if that makes sense. Did I make sense in terms of the contextualization?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joey. This is very, 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 very helpful. I hear exactly what you're trying to get at. As you mentioned, it is a huge question, and it is, in a way, an elephant in the room. And one way, before I say a few words about the historical trajectories of this generation, and then go back to the present. Mm-hmm. The main, one of the big questions that has been a question which is not only a Lebanese or an Arab question, but has been a question that a lot of Marxists have dealt with across generations, which in Lebanon mostly takes the form of sort of sectarian solidarities, but I would say also regional and kinship and family loyalties. The sort of focus on just sectarianism, I think, occludes, in a way, other infranational solidarities and loyalties. Is the question of what is the status of attachments that are not considered to be emancipatory attachments in a revolutionary project? I.e., what is the status of, in the Marxist tradition, this took the form of nationalism, nationalism versus class solidarities. In our sort of Lebanese case, most of the time it's the question of sectarianism. But and this generation tried to deal with it in very different ways. The idea is it possible to have, for example, a political project that is not predicated on sort of assuming that everyone that is part of this project is going to be secular? I.e., you see, because as you mentioned, from an activist's perspective, the dilemma is is very, very transient, which is, if you want to interpolate the largest number of people possible into the political program that you are advocating, where are the lines you draw between accommodating certain subjectivities and certain attachments and certain solidarities, and where do you say, I can no longer accommodate these attachments, subjectivities, solidarities, because if I do, they're gonna overtake my project. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's always a very, which is why the last part of this book is really about thinking about Ibn Khaldun and Gramsci, because it is really a question that sort of like, you can think with through the question of Gramsci. How can you create a counter hegemony to the hegemony that's basically the system is putting forward? And how can you, in doing that, not come across as being someone who's sort of disrespectful of particular forms of attachments that people have? Because what do we mean by sectarianism is a very, very fraught question. Do we mean as some kind of belonging into a community that sort of like fashions people's subjectivities? Do we mean by it a certain political identity? Do we mean by it participating in a clientelistic system? These are not all the same. Sometimes they map onto each other, but sometimes they don't. And the question of subjectivity is mostly should be thought through as not as an on-off switch, i.e. like a on-secular or like on-sectarian switch, but rather as a question of a spectrum and potentialities that are basically can be activated in one way or another. Like the question of hegemony. And this is something that we saw very, very clearly in October, in the sort of like in the trajectory that unfolded starting October 17th, 2019. The fact that you can have people change, and then you can also have people regress if you want to think about it in the other direction. So the question is very, very difficult to deal with. That the generation I dealt with, in order to become part of these Marxist groups, these militant intellectuals and militants had to leave their initial communities, i.e. had to leave the political parties that were hegemonic in their own political communities. So they had to say, let's say if they are Christian from, Mount Lebanon, they would have to say, okay, I am not joining the Phalangists, I am not joining the Ahrar, I am not joining any of these parties, I'm joining, let's say, the Lebanese Communist Party or the Organization of Communist Action Lebanon. Now, so after some of these militants ended up joining their communities back. Some of them ended up sort of like, which is not the same thing, ended up converting ideologically to an Islamist position. And for some of these people, it entailed a personal religious conversion. People like Roger Assaf, for example, the famous, basically, playwright. So in a way, there are different trajectories that people have. Sometimes they move back to the folds of the communities that they had left for a secular ideological project. Sometimes they move from one ideological project to another. But the question of basically, the fascinating sort of, I think, insight of this 1960s generation is that when dealing with sectarian loyalties, is that, you see, they were dealing with sectarian loyalties in the very, very crucial space of organizing in factories, i.e. at the point of production. And there, the crucial insight they developed is that these form of solidarities are very malleable, that basically you could sort of marshal them for the workers' interests, but also they could be marshaled against the workers' interests. So in a way, there's a particular resilience to these sort of like forms of sort of sectarian attachment, And there's also a form of non-teleology that's inscribed into them, i.e., the only thing you can be sure of is that when you're dealing with them, their force is going to be sort of reproduced, whether you push them towards an emancipatory project or not. I'll give you a very small example. So, the way, for example, they can enter into relations of production is, let's say, by having workers in a factory from a particular sect, but then having the foreman, let's say, that's responsible for them from a different sect. Or basically the owner of the factory sort of giving different wages to people from different villages or different sects or something like that. So in a way, then you can have, let's say, workers mobilize for their own rights, but that mobilization for their own rights could be sometimes articulated on these sort of forms of sectarian solidarity. So in a way, if you're thinking about workers getting their own rights, that could be, quote unquote, a good thing. Yet what's happening is that it's the form itself that's reinscribed. So the idea that I'm trying to basically there's two ideas I'm trying to sort of push. One is that we have to sort of be clear about what do we mean when we talk about sectarianism, and how is this different from basically being someone who's secular or being someone who's religious, i.e. not to conflate sectarianism with a certain religious subjectivity, because I don't think they're the same. But also how to think about the question of sectarianism as, again, as I said, as a personal attachment to a particular way of life, or a political identity that sees in furthering the interest of the sect its main goal and sees other sects, quote unquote, as threatening that, and sectarianism as part of a patronage clientelistic system. And in thinking about these three things, the main question is there a possibility to develop a political language that will interpolate people from different, say, sects and bring them together without necessarily sort of having the grievances that this political project is pushing forward seem by another sect to be a sectarian project. And that's a tall order. You see, I mean, it's tricky. It's very tricky, and it's also, I mean, the pessimistic side of the equation is that you see that these sectarian forms are very resilient across history. Like you can fill them with different content. You can be a sectarian politically and arguing for a welfare state. You can be a neoliberal and basically be articulating your sort of neoliberal agenda, but also articulating it with some kind of sectarian formation. So there is a resilience to it, which you called, which I think is what you meant by structure. And in that way, if you want to do a very, a sort of an analogy which is from a very different register, you can think, for example, about sort of Orientalism as a structure of racialization and inferiority as having a very similar kind of resilience that can take on board anything and digest it. So, for example, you can have Darwinian Orientalism, you can have a Freudian Orientalism, you can have a liberal Orientalism, you can have an Orientalism that's basically doing, things like pinkwashing or basically green imperialism or something like that. But you see that there's a structure there that could reproduce itself and take on board different positions. So in a way, but sectarianism has that sectarian attachments, if you so to speak, have this resilience. But I do not think. I think that to succumb to a culturalist position in which basically to say that we are doomed to a repetition because of our culture is the negation of politics, and is basically a metaphysical position that's not warranted, even though historically these forms have been very resilient. It's just basically saying that there is no end in sight to try and think of a political sort of project that is no longer, that would basically not be divided according to these lines, and that would not lead into the kind of form of violence that sometimes these divisions lead to in terms of communal civil strife. So it's like a long answer, but it's basically, I think the answer is in trying to think through different forms of political practice, by which I mean that I don't think a better theory will save us, but I think maybe a theory that sort of like comes out of thinking about political practice and trying things out is, in a very dialectical way, would be something which would be helpful. But I do. I mean, what you said about, again, your activist years and how that rings true to you, rings true to me as well, as someone from a different generation who in the 90s were, as part of generations of students in universities, were interested in thinking the question of the left and thinking about having a conversation with different generations, but also people from different sects and from different regions, so that you do not end up reproducing the sort of ideological sectarian contraption where you could say something like the majority of the right would be Christian and the majority of the left would be, Muslim or something of that sort. So that the ideological and the communal, in a way, so to speak, would not be, because this is the problem. When the ideological agenda becomes articulated on a communal constituency, it's the communal constituency at the end of the day that's gonna overcome the ideological agenda. Yeah, I think we talked a lot about this.
No, I'm gathering my thoughts. You gave me a lot to think here, Dr. Fadi. Really, is there anything that you wanted to say that I didn't ask or we didn't have time to talk about?
No, we had, like, in our exchange, we had you mentioned something to me about, like, why do I say, and we can end with this. It's a very sort of quick answer. Why do I say that, for these thinkers, why do I think it's important to say that they moved away from this sort of like language game of comparing Arab and Islamic values with Western ones?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And let me say a few things about that. But what I mean by that is that if you look at a lot of work that is done, by post-colonial sort of like thinkers or ideologists, or the Arab ones are not an exclusion, you always have this sort of like question of the West as an ideological question. Whether it is basically thinkers who are modernization thinkers who really want to get rid of whatever they think is, quote unquote, backwards culture, or the opposite, whether you have nativists who think that basically we need to go back and recapture our authenticity against basically modernity, which is a project of westernization in disguise. And the thinkers I'm working with, I think we're not operating on this ideological register of us versus them, authenticity versus modernity, our values, their values, foreign thought versus sort of like authentic foreign thought. What they were interested in is developing something which is, I think, I'm interested in thinking about, and which is basically, and people in the South Asian context have thought of, people like Partha Chatterjee has thought about, which is how do you move away from the discourse of ideological values into trying to develop, if you want, a critical social or political theory of the operations of power in the post-colony. Because you can stop. You can either play the ideological game and say, our values, their values, etc., or you can basically play the kind of epistemology critique of Orientalist discourses game, whereby you say, well, this theory is Eurocentric and it cannot understand, basically our societies, our politics, etc. But I think that's first, it's a very boring game. And second, it's not, because it's been done and it's very easy. It doesn't take much sort of critical thought to come up with it. You just put the sort of thing into the machine and it comes out directly. I think the more interesting question is, after you do this negative critical labor of saying Western, so to speak, or whatever, universalist social or political theory is not one that adequately can sort of conceptually apprehend the realities we're living from. Fine, okay, that's the negative move. Then the positive one is, can we develop a critical idiom of the operations of power in our societies? And why do I say power? Because I want to move away from basically culture. And I want to basically get a sense of, can we develop conceptual tools that adequately diagnose the multiplicity of the operations of power in our societies? And this is why I say, they're trying to think about for example, in Waddah Sharara's attempt to think the logics of subjugation that are at the heart of communal sort of like civil wars, ones which are at the opposite of Gramscian hegemony, because you do not seek to win over your enemy ideologically. You just seek to either subjugate them or destroy them. You don't want to convert them. You're not interested in reforming their subjectivity. You're just interested in having their leader, whoever their leader is, be subjugated to you. But how the leader himself deals with his or her, subject, it's up to them. So in a way, it's trying to think with these thinkers. It's not necessarily to adopt their theories and to say this is the theory we need now, but it's to actually try and move away from these two registers I outlined in the beginning. One is the register of ideology and value, the West and us. And the second one is the register of, basically another register of the West and us, which is basically how Western theory does not work. The question is, yes, if it does not work, then, what works? Or can we try and develop something that works? And that's, I think, that's one thing I wanted to sort of to mention.
Thank you, really very much. This has been a very, very interesting conversation. I'm going to reread the book very soon after this conversation. And I definitely urge everyone to do so. And I will link it in the description and in the show notes as well. Fadi, thank you a lot for your time.
Thank you, Joey. Thanks again for your interest and for reading the book and for thinking about these questions intergenerationally. That makes 3 generations of people thinking about them. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.